the resources required in terms of human, financial, or otherwise in order to start up and maintain successful tablet deployment, especially in the case of small organizations like private or K-12 schools? Giovanni, any insights?
Actually, most of these questions are interlinked among each other, and it's interesting to realize that iPad was launched in 2010, right? So I have an iPad 2, particularly, it's mine. And now I'm facing the need of changing for a new one, because as long as the time they update the operational system, the device turns slower and slower and slower. And this is natural. I was expecting that it happens. When you think about very large-scale deployment, you are not talking about bring your own device. You've got to think about this cost, because one day you'll need to substitute the older device by the new one. And this is a very important cost, because, for example, in Los Angeles, they are spending $500 million, if I'm not wrong. Imagine you've got to use these $5 billion during 3-4 years. After this time, you've got to expand again. So it's related to the first question about the inequality of content that is overcame by the use of HTML5. And once you concentrate the content is attendance in everything in HTML5, doesn't matter the device. Any device will work for you. And in case of Android, you have not only one provider, but you have dozens of providers. You have conditions to choose the level of the quality of the hardware. So it's a very important hidden cost that be considered, because you don't buy the equipment just once. You've got to replace that equipment every 3 or 4 years. And if you put it in the paper, the calculus, you see that it's a problem that we haven't faced it yet, because it's quite new phenomenon. But your institutions that bought the first generations of iPad, probably next year, you've got to buy new ones. And there comes again the cost, everything, like brand new deployment.
So for Virginia and Christina again, is this an issue that's starting to crop up at your institutions? I know it's not starting to crop up at our institution here, because we're just doing some small scale experimentation with a handful of devices. But how about at Qatar Foundation or HCT? Is this issue starting to come up of the cost of devices becoming obsolete?
Well, for us, we do replace our iPads, the iPads that we give to our teachers. So as new ones come up, we replace the old ones. For the students, they have to buy their own, so it's a cost that they have to cover. For us, the hidden cost is more the time that our faculty have to spend on learning how to use the iPad, sourcing the different apps that they would like to use in the classroom, teaching the students how to use those apps, and designing materials and resources that would utilize those apps in different tasks. And this is over and above the hours that they have to be face-to-face with the students. So for us, the time that our faculty are investing in all these activities is huge, and it would be what happened in the past when we had laptops we had a lot of resources that our faculty had created for the laptops. And when we moved to the iPads and iPads could not handle Flash, a lot of those resources had to be redesigned. And that, again, was a huge investment of time on the part of our teachers. So if we are going to move to another device later on, then they will start again the cycle of redesigning, and at some point it just becomes too much.
So I'm getting the impression that this is all coming back to the same issue that we discussed when answering the first question, that you do have costs associated on the technical side, and it probably is very easy to predict those, and with the case that Cherie mentioned, it's a matter of throwing money at the technical side. The human side is the more expensive, and the one that you can't get away from that expense. You're always going to have the human side to deal with. Is this perhaps a case of where we have to stop looking at how we're going to address the technical side and focus more on the human, on the pedagogical side, because eventually our learners are going to have devices, and we need to focus on how more on how we're going to utilize them on actually getting devices out there. Dr. Ali, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the problem is we are using the business model to deploy tablets in the education system, where you have to upgrade your tablet every time there's a new version that comes out. We need to move away from the business model in education, design our own tablet that will last for 10, 15 years. And so that social justice, I mean, everyone should have a tablet, everyone should have affordable connectivity. So we need to move away from the business model where you have to upgrade your tablet every year because the company wants to make billions of dollars. So I think we need to look at that, the model of deployment, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. A lot of the questions that have been posted here on the site do address topics similar to what we've already talked about. So before I open up to see if there's any questions from the audience, there was one when I was looking through this that piqued my interest a couple of days ago, and I think Dr. Ali might be able to provide the best insight into this with the programs he's been involved with. And this is, what about stealing of mobile devices by family? This is a question that never crossed my mind, especially in this part of the world here. But I'm sure that in some cultures, it's a very serious issue that has to be dealt with, especially when we're talking about institutions issuing devices to their learners, but then once you get back outside of the walls of the school to the family home, the ideas of property ownership become a little more fluid, and then you have issues of seniority within the family and more senior family members possibly co-opting devices for their own use. And the question here that was posed by Philip Townsend was, in some societies, personal ownership of property is not a feature of that society. If an institution issues a device to students, that device might be taken by relatives and not returned to the student. So if the person taking the device, let me bring up the full question here, the full text. If the person taking the device is older than the student might not have the authority within the culture to ask for it to be returned. So have any institutions actually encountered this matter? And if so, how have institutions helped students to maintain possession? How have they dealt with security issues and with institutional ownership of those devices? Completely
most of
off topic from what we've been talking about so far, but a very interesting concern.
It is an interesting question. I assume they're referring to stealing the time to use the device, so the student doesn't have enough time to use the device.
Or actually taking the device themselves and saying, well, I need one of these, this will be great for me for work, so I'm going off into the bush and I'm going to take this with me, or I'm going to run business and I'm going to use your device, you don't have it anymore.
Depends on how many children in the family. In North America, most people have one child, so you can't steal from one. So no, I think that's a major issue, but with mobile devices, tablets so cheap today, I think everyone in the family can have one.
But how about in developing countries? There are instances in developing countries where that cost factor of more than one device per family is prohibitive.
I've never encountered that problem with anyone in developing countries.
Okay. Sure. Alexander.
I don't see this as a technical problem. This is like sometimes there are issues I have in my day-to-day job, and I say this is like a policy problem. At a technical side, if you're going to talk in general about theft, and this goes back to the previous question about amortization costs, what are the costs you can spend outside of the initial purchase? There are different types of systems. There's one dedicated built into the iPhone, which I'm sure many people in this room are probably already familiar with, where you can like find your device and then you can basically do things to it, like send pop-ups and make loud, obnoxious noises. So if it's within the proximity of you, you can hear it, and then it was awkward because then you can walk up to the person and take it back. You can also do what's called remotely breaking the device. That there are different services beyond the proprietary one built into the iPhone for Android and other systems, where basically you can send a signal if there's an active network connection. I know that's a very big if. Or in some cases, text messages to basically tell the device, don't destroy the hardware, but destroy all the software on it, so that basically it's useless. That obviously is not exactly intended for the educational sphere. It's really intended for the business sphere. Like, I have sensitive information that I don't want other people to see, and I can destroy it. But I mean, if you really want to get back at your dad, I would say bricking your own device means eventually he'll have to give it back to you if he wants it to work again. But a lot of these solutions go back to another problem, which I see, just to touch on also the previous question, is a lot of such things that are useful are institutionally specific or they're device specific. And there are very few people when working on services for devices that won't focus or give preference to one device. So you're kind of, up a creek depending on what the choice you make. But in any event, I guess if you want a kind of humorous answer, you could wipe the device from your relative and then they just have a paperweight. I don't know.
I can vouch for that. I just went a few rounds with my 12-year-old about his use of his iPad, and that Find My iPhone is a great solution to making it impossible for him to use it for anything and limit his access. So there are some built-in options there.
Also to follow up, if we're not, there was an interesting question about what you mean by theft. If you mean theft of time versus theft of the device, it's not so ironic. I would imagine that Android has moved in this direction, and I'm not sure so much what the iOS or Apple direction will be, but inevitably I think it will take that turn, that there's an expectation that it's not one device to person. Apple, it's a little more complicated because of how deeply the services they provide on top of the actual hardware relate to like your email address and an Apple ID. In the case of Android, what they're moving towards actually in the future will be to have multiple user accounts on a device, and you'd be like, why would I possibly want that? I would imagine maybe people particularly be interested in the case of Brazil, especially if you have multiple students sharing a device, what that does. Now, I'm not saying this is not like a perfect solution, but I'm saying that I would imagine that mobile device providers probably see this as a potential concern, that that tablets aren't always for one person, especially in developing markets, which is where they're, again, this is because we focus so much on business deployment. I completely agree with you, by the way. The fact that we let business dictate educational tools is ridiculous. But because we do, they also see this need becoming more pressing. I need to move into a market where not everyone can afford a device, but I need to give people the ability, or a family, to share a device. Or in the case of a parent, make sure your child doesn't use the device and does something other than using it. As much as I guess I can advocate them, there are other things to do, I suppose. So.
Thank you. I would encourage everybody here in the audience, the link again for the site where these questions is posted is just mlearn13.idea.informer.com. And you can actually post comments to each of these questions. So if anybody in the audience or any of our panel members have further insights they'd like to share on any of the questions, including the ones that were not specifically addressed by the panel today, please log on to the site and post your comments. The link will remain on the conference website. We are going to do that now. So please, certainly, if you have insights about the questions that have already been posed and answers that might be helpful to the people who pose those questions, by all means, help us out by doing that. And what I'm going to do now is open it up for questions from our live audience here. So does anybody have a question for any of our panel members? And please, if you have a specific panel member in mind you'd like to address the question to, then let us know. Yes? Did you have a specific panel member in mind?
I just want to start as the IT guy because I think you'll find this amusing. A bad student is going to fail regardless of how many mobile devices you give him. And as a guy who loves technology, I'll just tell you flat out, I agree that the paradigm shift is probably more important than the device. You could also influence a classroom, not that I've taught professionally, I've taught from time to time, but there are ways to put the focus back on the student without having to buy a $300 piece of hardware, or $300 US piece of hardware, to put it in perspective, right? So I would agree that it's more methodology. That methodology could include technology, but the technology is not like, an ends and a means at the same time. So just saying.
And I'll second what AJ has said, and I think what we found for our students in our pilot project is that it brought the content and the learning back to them at their convenience, and that was what made the change and what made the success. And the students found the mobility of even just the difference between having to carry around an iPad versus their laptop, both of which were provided to them. They didn't want to have to lug their iPad plus, their laptop plus all their textbooks. So they'd much rather just take the iPad with all that content on their iPad, and they actually interacted with that content on a much richer level because it was accessible anytime, anywhere, any place. And that's, I think, what was the strength in our project and what the students loved about it.
Feedback from our students say that with the mobile learning, it's more learner-centered. So they can learn anytime, anywhere, and they can go on the internet, and also it's more interactive. And because of that, it results in higher level learning, which means they have to think about information, they have to process it, and they collaborate with other students, they teach them, they mentor them, etc., which results in better learning. So it's a combination of factors.
Well, I think it helps to motivate students. As you know, in the UAE, and I think it's the same in all the GCC countries, we have a huge problem with student motivation and engagement. And I think using a device like the iPad with the different apps and the different tasks that the teachers can design using those apps enthuses the students to engage more with those tasks and participate more in the classroom. So more engagement and increased motivation, of course, leads to more learning. And the second aspect that we have seen in our project is the engagement of students with English learning activities outside of the classroom. It wasn't something that we pursued, but students were happier to do tasks outside the classroom, do projects that involve them in using the iPad outside the classroom, and they were very happy to do that because they were exciting projects. It included videos, it included vodcasts, it included podcasts, it included everything, all sorts of multimedia and modalities that the students just love to do that kind of thing. So for us, and with the young generation that we're working with, the device did make a difference, and that translated into higher gains in learning.
I think teaching and learning still comes first. Good teaching with technology is even better. Good learning with technology is even better. But if you don't have good teaching and you add technology, you don't have a good solution. And if you don't have good learning and you add technology, it doesn't assist either. So I think the technology can be a tremendous benefit. And we see it with our students, how motivated, as Christina says, it can be motivating it can be for them, and how active their learning can be if we use the tools in the correct way. But the teaching and learning focus and the focus on the student as the center of that is where we have to start.
I think these comments echo the sentiment that I made in a presentation a couple of days ago. I think it might have been Dean and Belinda's presentation, when I commented that perhaps it's time that we stopped asking the question as to whether or not embedding devices in the classroom improve learning, and start asking if preventing these devices from being in the classroom erects an artificial barrier to learning amongst students who are accustomed to using these devices now. Any further questions?
We are at a stage where we can choose or not choose to use a device. We have to use a device because this is how this generation of students are used to. They're used to using a device. Our challenge as educators is finding the best way to utilize those devices so that they enhance our students' learning. And that's something that we need to keep getting better at.
Another reason is because in the near future, all learning materials will be electronic. No more textbook, no more paper. You need to have a device to access the electronic materials.
Questions, gentleman up front. Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Tom, I think you had a question?
If we look into the future, I mean, if you think back 15 years ago, we're going to have mobile phones, tablets. You can imagine that. Maybe in the near future, we'll have ubiquitous devices where you will not take a physical device with you. The information will exist in your walls, in your cars, etc., so no one can steal it. So things will become ubiquitous, so we won't have the problem of stealing.
It's interesting. It's related to the hidden costs, because the tablet itself, it doesn't work alone. The tablet, it's not a good device for producing knowledge, for producing content. You've got to have some side device, computers, smart boards, among other peripheral devices. So when you consider that you are to deploy devices in a classroom, you've got to think in some costs that at first are unthinkable. Like you've got to have a lot of sockets to recharge the batteries, because probably some students will need it. You've got to have more structure, for more electrical, a better electrical infrastructure in order to support the energy consumption. You've got to have not only the device itself, but when you, depending on the strategy, the pedagogical strategy that you are going to use to present the content that you have in the device, you have to have a projector, a smart board. So there are a lot of other items to be considered in the deployment. If you don't consider it, if you just think in the device itself, it will work in the first moment, the moment that you change the paper for the electronic device, but the novelty won't last too long, and it won't work in the mid or in the long term.
The electricity thing is, I guess, an interesting point. I can't really date myself, I guess, with this, but I remember I wasn't the first person in my family to have a mobile phone. It was my father years ago. And I think even from the onset, if I remember correctly, most people assumed it was an always-on device. Rarely did people turn it off, because you always are important and you always have people to talk to. I think tablets and other devices, people believe that to be an extension. And I personally, an Android user in my beyond my technical capacity of actually working on iPads, the user interface of almost all operating systems that involve mobile devices and tablets, among the worst part of the interface is, how do I turn this device completely off? I assume there's an intent for that. Most people come with the expectation the device should always be on. Like right now, my phone is off because I'm talking here. Like I can turn it completely off. I don't just put it on silent. I don't need my device to be on all the time. But I believe the expectation in the design itself is that it's always on. That might not be so great for countries with power requirements and reliability, either at the institutional, regional, or national level, depending on how large we're talking. As far as insurance goes, I'll just tell you, in our organization, we actually do give our students laptops, and when we give someone a laptop, it's a "you break it, you bought it" policy. So we kind of tell them up front that anything that they break is then their financial responsibility, and we let them know how expensive it is exactly. Most of the time, that's an incentive for people to be nicer to the devices, but I don't know. And to address the previous comment about durability devices, I know that your concern is that we should update them for better performance all the time. I'm a relative technology addict. I also like shiny new toys. But I mean, it's not beyond the ability of us to make, eventually the gains in performance at the hardware level are actually getting smaller and smaller over time. There's a lot of talk about this because of Moore's law and processors. They're reaching the limits of how much hardware that they can shove into a tiny area at this point in the next 5 or 10 years. So if we make devices more rugged, I don't think that's a problem. And to say that that's not possible seems silly to me, because I think most militaries in the world have devices that you can basically shoot at, and they can take sufficient force and still function. So the fact that people and students who are much younger than me can easily break devices, I mean, they're reliable and very sturdy now, but that will only get better over time. So I think it's not unreasonable to believe that if there are requirements and it can be done, I believe it could be, but I just also, like him, I believe that it's a business development issue and that companies don't, it's not in their interest to build something that will last 10 years and put them out of money. So no one will do it. So the laptop, the one laptop per child project was very interesting, but they, like, to make something that cheap, you actually have to use lower grade components. So no one wanted to make one expensive. To make one expensive and rugged, the inverse, would be a very interesting project, but I don't think there's any charitable organization that'd be willing to fund that, even the Gates Foundation, ironically. So.
Thank you. I think we can field just one more question, and then it'll be time for coffee and for the poster presentations out in the main lobby. Up front.
Personally for me, okay, I know you're asking for something to be like a short blurb. I'm not sure if you know what the open source software movement is, or the idea of like people making software and computer software for free and having licenses that restrict people from actually using it and making people pay money. I'm a very big believer of that in my personal life, but there's nothing, I would say, I was just having this conversation out in the hall, there's nothing more antithetical to using technology in education than proprietary systems that are intentionally locked down and restrict people from educating. So if I have to buy it from people who won't let me modify the device I paid for, frankly, it's not worth me paying for. And that's why I have a relatively strong opposition personally to Apple. Beyond that, that would be, Android is also not this great in this regard. If you're in the know, you know that there are lots of problems with companies who take free operating systems and the parts that actually interact with the hardware are proprietary, and those companies won't give that away because they're afraid it will hurt them. So as long as we encourage companies to kind of box us into using their devices, be it at the software or hardware level, these problems that I discussed will still be relevant 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. And that's the way it's going to be. So.
Giovanni.
I have a comment about it because, well, pragmatically speaking, it's important that when you are willing to use some kind of technology for education purpose, it's important you look at the business use of that technology. Otherwise, you will find the same situation of OLPC. It was a technology dedicated exclusively, was created exclusively for educational purpose. And unfortunately, because they didn't have a business background to support it, they sold around 2.5 million devices around the world and died. Nowadays, they have 6 employees. And they have changed to a tablet paradigm already. So you've got to have the business background in your educational initiatives, because once you do it, you have a minimal guarantee that your choice will be supported in the long term. And suddenly you won't find yourself alone in the market. It's very important. It's why I believe that HTML5 will be a good option. Not because it's a good option itself. It's a good option, but because there are a lot of corporate interest on making HTML5 the standard to access the hardware of the device. If you count on it, that's okay. You can go ahead without fear that you are taking the right choice. But if you take some technology, if you try to implement some technology exclusively developed for educational purpose, I guess you have a high risk of having problems in middle or long term.
Yeah, I think the ideal education device should be durable, which means you can use it in plus 52 degrees and minus 52 degrees. Also, if you take a look at the current tablets and smartphones, to charge the battery, you have to plug it in, because in North America you have lots of electricity. In Europe, you can plug it in easily. We need an education device where you can get the power, charge it in different ways, maybe solar, maybe if you crank the computer will charge, etc. So we need to look and see how we design, how we power the device for education so that the battery can last for 48 hours, 50 hours. There's a question there. Oh. The future of mobile learning, yes. It will be ubiquitous, which means you won't be taking a physical device with you. Maybe in 5 years there will be no tablets or phone, they will just exist everywhere. So I think in the future it will be mainly in terms of learning, less involvement of teachers, more learner-centered, because the students will be able to access the learning material. Because if you think back 200 years ago, 100 years ago, most of the information was in the teacher's head. So the teacher had to stand up and convey the information. Now it exists in electronic media, so the students can actually use the technology to access the learning materials. So there will be more, because of the access, there will be less use of teacher as deliverer of information, more of a facilitator. It'll be learning, ubiquitous learning, where the learning materials will exist in the walls in your home, in your car, and it'll be emotional computing. So your car will decide whether you're in a good mood based on your temperature and your facial expression. And if you're in a good mood, it's going to give you some information, some learning materials. So it'll be ubiquitous, learning.
Thank you very much to our panel discussion members, and thank you everyone in the audience. Jocelyn, that was a very interesting question that you posed, so I have put it up on the ID Informer site under your name. And again, I encourage everyone to visit the site even though the panel discussion is now over, and to post your thoughts, your answers as comments to these questions. And I would be very interested in seeing what everybody's answers are to Jocelyn's question. What is the one feature you would like to see in a dedicated tablet for educational deployment?
Yeah, let's build a tablet for education, just for education. Yes.
So we are a little bit behind our printed schedule in terms of starting the poster presentations. So I invite everyone to the lobby for coffee now. The poster presentations will be